Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing.
Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the C. Shelby Rooks Lecture. My name is Don Clark, and as acting president, I welcome you to Chicago Theological Seminary. I extend a warm welcome to the Board of Trustees who convened today and will continue meeting tomorrow. I welcome the faculty and staff of Chicago Theological Seminary, and I welcome the students here at the seminary. To those joining us in person and those joining us online, I welcome you to Chicago Theological Seminary. Tonight I offer a special welcome to our Rooks keynote speaker, the Reverend Dr. Raphael G. Warnock. Thank you for joining us tonight, sir. We look forward to your lecture. Reverend Warnock, who will receive a more complete introduction later in the evening, joins a distinguished group of brilliant scholars and faith leaders who have come to CTS to deliver the Rooks Lecture. The C. Shelby Rooks Lecture is an annual event in the life of Chicago Theological Seminary, celebrating the Center for Black Faith and Life through scholarship, advocacy, and legacy. Thank you for joining us tonight for this event, and welcome to Chicago Theological Seminary.
I invite you to bow with me for the invocation. Holy God, we honor and bless you this evening. We invoke your presence as we celebrate the life and legacy of the Reverend Charles Shelby Rooks, a man committed to theological education and social justice. Thank you for blessing CTS and the world with his presence. Holy and righteous God, clear our minds of the busyness of the day. Open our ears, minds, and hearts so that we may be able to receive. Inflame our passion for justice into a commitment to address unjust situations and structures. Deepen our concern for our friends, neighbors, and loved ones who are most vulnerable, enduring the burdens of poverty, mass incarceration, and exploitation. Banish any complacency in our hearts and minds. May we always act in the spirit of justice. May we envision, pray about, and create a different sort of world in which injustice is replaced with a renewed sense of solidarity and care. I pray in the name of Jesus, as each one of us prays in the name of the one we have come to know. Amen.
A legacy, by definition, is something passed on from a predecessor or the past. It is a gift intended to support, direct, and sustain a coming generation based on the hard work and sacrifice of the former. It may be money or property, but it can also take the form of commitments and values that guide and direct. Today, we honor the life and ministry of Charles Shelby Rooks, and in so doing, we receive anew an inheritance that enlivens our work and sharpens our witness as we move into the future. Charles Shelby Rooks was born on October the 19th, 1924, in Beaufort, North Carolina. His family's roots in the United Church of Christ tradition go back to 1879, when his great-great-grandfather organized a congregational church in Beaufort. Rooks spent his formative years in Harlem and Brooklyn, New York, in Norfolk, Virginia, and later served in the military. He went on to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree from Virginia State University and a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary in New York. He did additional graduate studies at Columbia University Teachers College in New York, Oxford University in England, the North American College in Rome, Italy, and the Episcopal Theological Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas. After academic preparation, Rooks began his professional ministry as a minister of the Lincoln Memorial Congregational Church, the oldest African-American congregational church in Washington, D.C. His passion for preaching God's word and encouraging others took him across the United States and to 3 continents where he engaged in ministry in a variety of settings. Through his tireless work in ecumenical circles, he collaborated with the National Council of Churches through its Department of Ministry, its Division of Church and Society, and its Commission for Higher Education. Moving to administration in the United Church of Christ, Rooks served as the Executive Vice President of the Board for Homeland Ministries. During his tenure, he addressed issues of health and welfare, evangelism and church extension, and Christian education. He also worked faithfully on the board of directors of the UCC Office of Communications, supporting social justice publications and shaping programs to combat discrimination in broadcasting. Throughout his career, Charles Shelby Rooks was a strong advocate for the preparation and support of church leaders through theological education, most notably serving as the president of Chicago Theological Seminary from 1974 to 1984. This earned him the distinction of being the first African American to lead a predominantly white theological school. He also worked faithfully with the Fund for Theological Education and was a founding member of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. As a result of his work and witness as pastor, preacher, activist, administrator, and ecumenical leader, Charles Shelby Rooks has left us a rich legacy. His unwavering commitment to engage in ministry in diverse contexts, his unrelenting determination to work with and on behalf of those on the margins of society, and his uncompromising energy to aim for excellence in theological education provides a clear template for our work ahead. John Thomas, past general minister of the UCC and former senior advisor to the president at CTS, said, "Shelby's commitment to theological education and the public responsibility of the church will be an enduring legacy for a church seeking leaders sensitive to the gospel, to the demands of justice." My sisters and brothers, the legacy continues even today through the Adrian M. and Charles Shelby Rooks Fellowship, providing full-time and part-time grants to support seminary education for underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in the United Church of Christ. For more information, see the link on the back of your program. Thank you.
Good evening. One of my happy assignments as academic dean is to announce the recipient of this year's C. Shelby Rooks Legacy Award. Eris Simpson, would you come forward? Our Rooks Scholar this year is a community activist and educator in her third year of study at Chicago Theological Seminary. Having previously earned a BA at Chicago State University, she entered the Master of Divinity program at CTS in 2015 and was awarded the prestigious Jeremiah A. Wright Jr. Scholarship. She has been a member of Trinity United Church of Christ for over 20 years, sharing her gifts with the deacon ministry, the education ministry, the married couples ministry, the justice and witness team, and the Africa ministry. She developed a nonprofit organization, Global Acts, committed to encouraging youth agency to produce positive citizenship nationally and internationally. And she has been instrumental in the development of an ethno-educational initiative. I love that phrase. Which emphasizes cultural experience and cultural differences as foundations for learning and living. She's also been involved with Chicago State University's 21st Century Graduate and Professional Students Academic Studies Initiative, the Chicago Renewal Society, the Chicago Religious Leadership Network, and other initiatives. And here at CTS, she helps to organize our community life activities every week with Reverend Lisa Goods, including coordination of our worship services. For all of these reasons and more, I am happy to announce that this year's C. Shelby Rooks Legacy Award goes to Eris Simpson. I have an envelope for you, Madam Chair.
I'm joined tonight by Eddie Taylor Jr., a blues legend in his own right, but the son of a blues legend too. Eddie Taylor Jr. is going to be honored at Buddy Guy's on Sunday evening and inducted into their Hall of Fame. And so I want you to... I'm going to be singing a song that I wrote last spring for the womanist worship service that we had in March. They asked me to sing, and I didn't know what to sing, so I wrote a song. It's a blues song. It's called Purple Blues, and it addresses the deep angst that we feel about the killings of black folk around the country without recourse, without justice at all. And so to express my pain, I wrote this song, Purple Blues. Okay, there's a part in the song that the bridge goes, every time we turn around, they're making a bogus claim. Every time they turn around, we're going to say their names. And I'm going to call out a name, and you just call out any name that you want, because there are many you could choose from. Trayvon, Jonathan, Ayanna, Tamir, so many names you could call out, but we can only call out one in the context of a song. So I'm going to call out a name, and you just throw your voice in there when we get to the bridge, okay? All right. Eddie Taylor Jr. and me. I've got the blues. I've got the blues. I got the deep purple womanist consciousness, self-loving superwoman, broken-hearted black woman blues. Deep purple blues. Every day I've got to pray, 'cause I don't want to be tomorrow's bad news. Got the blues, got the blues. I got the deep purple womanist consciousness, self-love, superwoman, broken-hearted black woman blues. Deep purple blues. Every day I've got to pray, 'cause I don't want to be tomorrow's bad news. Every time we turn around, they are making a bogus claim. Every time they turn around, we're gonna say the name's Kanika. We heard for you. Every day we've gotta pray, if we don't wanna be tomorrow's bad news. Purple blues, purple blues, purple blues, purple blues. Deep purple blues. Every day we gotta pray, 'cause we don't wanna be tomorrow's bad news. Purple blues, purple blues, purple blues, purple blues. Deep purple blues. You know it's true. Day and night we gotta fight, if we don't wanna be tomorrow's bad news. Every time we turn around, they are making a bogus claim. Every time they turn around, we're gonna say their name, Sandra. We heard for you, and you know it's true. Every day we gotta pray, 'cause we don't wanna be tomorrow's bad news. Eddie Taylor Jr. Don't want to be tomorrow's bad news. Every time we turn around, they are making a bogus claim. Every time they turn around, we're gonna say their names to me. We heard for you. Don't you know it's true? Every day 'cause we don't want to be tomorrow's bad news.
Thank you, Dr. Terrell, for reminding us where the blues really comes from. In 2007, under the leadership of our very own Dr. Lee Butler, the Center for the Study of Black Faith and Life was founded here at Chicago Theological Seminary. The center is dedicated towards cultivating the next generation of leaders who will speak with prophetic voice and who will lift high the African American heritage of faith, freedom, and justice. We could not have asked for a better person to represent that heritage. The Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock was actually born into that heritage and has carried it forward. As you can see in your bio, he is the son of 2 Pentecostal pastors, and accepting his own call to ministry at an early age, he became the youngest to accept the senior pastorate of Ebenezer Baptist Church, the home of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The brothers got all the right papers: Master of Divinity, Master of Philosophy, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Union Theological Seminary. In addition, he is a scholar. He recently published The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness. And he's also a committed activist. His activism has been recognized by numerous organizations and media outlets. But for those of us who are fortunate enough to hear him talk with students today during lunch, you can actually see his heart, that when he says activism is an act of worship, he really means it. And he shared stories with us from his ministry. And he talked about what this has meant to keep scholarship and activism and faith connected. So without further ado, I give you Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock.
Let the church say amen. That's how you know you called a Baptist preacher to deliver the lecture. Thank you so very much, Dr. Ringer, for that wonderful and kind and generous introduction. With introductions like that, I'm always afraid to speak. I'd rather sit there and not disabuse you of anything that he said. But thank you so very much for your kindness. I've only been here for a few hours, and I'm at CTS for the first time. All right. But this is indeed a wonderful place that I have and feel connected to for so many reasons. And so thank you so much to President Don Clark for this invitation, and for the administration, the faculty, the Board of Trustees meeting here, some of whom are friends of mine and are engaged and active in so many ways. I'm tempted to call names, but there's so many of y'all, and I'll skip somebody. But you see me and I see you. And I'm so very glad that you are here tonight. To the students who make all of this work worthwhile, you in a real sense, a very real sense, are our reason for being here. An institution like this, you're our raison d'etre. So thank you. I enjoyed our conversation earlier today. All of my sisters and brothers to the committee for pulling this together. The leadership of Dr. Lee Butler and Reverend Ayanna Garrett and Ms. Kim Johnson and Dr. Julia Speller. Thank you all so very much. This is indeed a very, very high honor to be asked to come and speak in memory as we consider the legacy of one who lived in the intersection. Preacher, scholar, administrator, ecumenical leader, activist. One who ran until the wheels fell off, who embodied the kenosis about which the scripture speaks, who poured himself out for the legacy of Dr. C. Shelby Rooks, Reverend Dr. C. Shelby Rooks. We are indeed grateful, and I think it's only fitting and appropriate if we would just give God praise in the way we do in the Baptist church with thunderous acclamation for C. Shelby Rooks. All right. Y'all almost sounded Pentecostal. I've got friends here tonight, so many friends, but the Reverend Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell is my dear friend and big sister. When I arrived in the halls of Union Seminary a few years ago, she was already there and working on her doctorate. I was a first-year MDiv student, thinking about whether I would pursue a PhD, and she was indeed a source of encouragement and nourishment as I often went to her apartment, not just to engage her as an interlocutor, but to enjoy her cooking. She has many gifts, as you witnessed tonight. She's got the purple blues, and she's got soul food. She's got all of that all wrapped up, and she's such a gift to the Academy and the church. And another person that I met while I was in New York, for me to call him a friend really is an understatement. He's really my brother. And that's the pastor of the Oakdale Covenant Church right here in Chicago on Vincent's and 95th. Is that right? The Reverend Dr. D. Darrell Griffin. This is my brother. I want you to see him. Pastor Griffin. I spent my time in New York inspired by the legacy of persons like Shelby Rooks, trying to live in the intersection and moving between the Academy, Union Seminary, and Abyssinian Baptist Church. I had James Cone on one end and Calvin Butts on the other. And I'm here to testify that I survived. And I offer that to all of the doctoral students and those who are pursuing ordination at the same time. I'm grateful. So I want to talk tonight about black theology, the black church, and America's prison industrial complex. Emerging in the historical context of the civil rights and black power movements, black theology came into its voice as an important theological affirmation of the humanity of the oppressed, and as a radical response to racism, America's original sin, and its most persistent and intractable evil. Indeed, racism's intractability and stunning resourcefulness as a socio-political virus, capable of presenting itself first as institutionalized slavery, then mutating in the post-Reconstruction era into Jim Crow segregation and other manifestations of what Douglas Blackman rightly calls re-enslavement, can be accounted for in large measure by its sacralization through deep contradictions and glaring omissions in the theological reflections of white theologians, pastors, and the churches they represent. That is why black theology is so important. It is important in the history of theological discourse and American Christianity. Nascent black theologians rightly asked, how could white theologians in their Orthodox, liberal, and neo-Orthodox and evangelical variations speak credibly about a loving and just God while refusing to address themselves and their work to the doctrine of white supremacy and its social manifestations in slavery and in segregation? How could they be so silent about something so central and tragically consequential in American life? Martin Luther King Jr., whose movement did more than anything else to provide a larger context ripe for the emergence of the black theology movement, had already hinted at this epistemological problem inherent to the religion of the Christians who opposed his movement for freedom and human fulfillment. Writing in his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King avers, on sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, Dr. King said, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? In his landmark text, God of the Oppressed, black theologian James Cone proffers an answer to King's fundamental question. He accounts for the failure of theologians and pastors to address the deepest of American contradictions in this way. Cone says the history of white American theology illustrates the concept of the social a priori asserted by Werner Stark and the other sociologists of knowledge. The social environment functions as a mental grid, deciding what will be considered as relevant data in a given inquiry. For example, because white theologians are not the sons and daughters of black slaves, but the descendants of white slave masters, their theological grid, Cone argues, automatically excludes from the field of perception the data of Richard Allen, Henry Highland Garnett, and Nathaniel Paul, David Walker, and Henry McNeil Turner. This same axiological grid accounts for the absence of the apocalyptic expectations of the spirituals among the so-called hope theologians, and the same explanation can be given why the white existentialists do not say anything about absurdity in the blues. It is obvious that because white theologians were not enslaved and lynched and are not ghettoized because of color, they do not think that color is an important point of departure for theological discourse, thus giving voice to those on the underside of slavery and segregation as they asserted themselves in the expression black power and embodied institutionally in the NCBC, an organization of pastors and academic theologians working to define the parameters of an emerging discourse. Black theology rose as the people's apologia, a living theology, walking riot-torn streets and standing in the gap between Jerusalem and Athens, ivory towers and ebony trenches. Yet, when one considers this history, it is all the more remarkable and lamentable that black and womanist theologians who are writing today and who see justice making as central to the meaning of the gospel have had so very little to say about the theological implications of the socio-political virus of racism as it has mutated in its clearest and perhaps most consequential manifestation for black communities in America today, mass incarceration. To be sure, notwithstanding a burgeoning black middle class in the decades since the Civil Rights Movement and extraordinary examples of upward mobility and achievement, indeed a black president, all of this facilitated by the breaking down of many barriers, the masses of African American people are still mired in the complex web of problems that makes the disaggregation of any single issue difficult, and one might argue purely academic. Moreover, womanist thought has done much to illumine the multidimensional character of all oppression. But while recognizing the structural complexity of racism and its inextricable link to and participation with other constituent parts of hegemonic power, including sexism, classism, and militarism, I would argue that today mass incarceration is Jim Crow's most obvious descendant. And like its ancestor, its dismantling would represent not only substantive social transformation, but immeasurable transvaluative power in a society still bent on worshiping whiteness. I will present the evidence in support of my argument below. But a critical question guiding this inquiry, critical question that captures my mind and imagination is this: how is it that black churches, the historical conscience of the American churches, and black and womanist theologies as liberationist theologies, have yet to focus and find their public voice on the one social issue most steeped in the heretical doctrine of white supremacy, inasmuch as America's so-called criminal justice system is the one area of the society that is many more times rabidly racist than anything imaginable during the Civil Rights era, with tragic consequences for black families, black men and women and children, black communities. No one could have imagined while Dr. King was marching down the streets of Birmingham, Atlanta, and Chicago, the American prison industrial complex as it stands today. In some ways, one might well argue that America's current system of disproportionately sentencing and stigmatizing scores of black people in its so-called war on drugs is as dehumanizing and destructive as slavery itself. As we shall see, both represent, in many cases, a kind of life sentence. Yet, so far, few black churches and few black theologians have marshaled their institutional and intellectual resources in a way commensurate with the magnitude of this moral and humanitarian crisis. The question is, why not? In view of first-generation black theologian James Cone's observation that white theology in view of first-generation black theologian James Cone's observation about white theology in an earlier era, I ask in this era, is there something about the social environment of black theology and the mental grid of the black church that has rendered both mute with stammering tongues when it comes to the most stigmatized people of color in America today, black men and women warehoused in our nation's prison industrial complex? Could it be that both the black church and black theology are hampered in their respective vocations of meaningful social praxis and relevant critical reflection by their alienation from one another, and by the fact that the work of neither lives quite close enough to this problem that plagues the poorest of the poor for it to enter in a sustained way into its field of perception and praxis, has privilege, ecclesial and academic, left black pastors and black theologians blind or paralyzed or both. In view of their own history and vocation, how should black theology and the black churches think about the problem of mass incarceration? Sister Michelle Alexander, whose book I Lift Up Like an Evangelical pushes tracts on how to be saved, has persuasively argued in that important book of this generation that the mass incarceration of tens of thousands of black men for nonviolent, drug-related offenses and the lifelong consequences that result are constituent parts of the new Jim Crow. I agree. There is no clearer example of America's unfinished business with the project of racial justice in this era than the 21st century caste system engendered by its prison industrial complex. Moreover, I submit that there is no more significant scandal belying the moral credibility and witness of the American churches than their conspicuous silence as this human catastrophe has unfolded over the last now nearly 4 decades. The United States of America is unrivaled in the sheer size and magnitude and per capita representation of its prison population. Per capita and in terms of sheer numbers, no one comes close to us. We warehouse about a quarter of the world's prisoners, although Americans only account for about 5% of the world's population. China, with over 1 billion people, doesn't come close. We've outdone North Korea by far. For many years now, prison construction and maintenance, a major economic engine for many small towns and rural communities, has had little or nothing to do with actual crime rates. It is a privatized industry with Wall Street indexes and quarterly shareholder reports. The business of warehousing black bodies has created several cottage industries. In the telecommunications world, for example, as you try to call your loved one who's locked in a federal or state prison. Prisons have become big business. In a real sense, the issue that the Black Lives Matter movement is drawing our attention to, police brutality, is as predictable as it is tragic. You don't get to be the incarceration capital of the world by playing nice on the streets. Escalation is part of the game. And that's why in all of the American cities, half of the young black men, a third to half of the young black men are caught up somewhere in the matrix and control of the criminal justice system, or hampered in their social mobility or civic participation by the social stigma of a criminal record. Most of them are charged with nonviolent, drug-related offenses and are casualties in America's so-called war on drugs. It was a war as long as it was in Baltimore and on the south side of Chicago. And now that it is in the American suburbs, it is a medical crisis that requires our attention. This is not theoretical for me. I know this pain personally as one of my own brothers, my blood brother with whom I shared a room growing up, is now in his 20th year of a life sentence in federal prison without the possibility of parole for a first-time, non-violent, drug-related offense created by the state. No one died. No one even got high. And my brother is serving his 20th year tonight in a prison in the low country of South Carolina that sits where a plantation used to sit and still sits. Furthermore, having circulated through the criminal justice system and stigmatized as a convicted felon, these black men and women come out only to be confronted with all of the legalized barriers against which Martin Luther King Jr. and those who battled the old Jim Crow fought, including discrimination in housing, employment, voting. Some states you can't even get a barber's license, public benefits, and student loans. And so the recidivism is also tragic, but as predictable as it is tragic. Legally barred from the doors of entry to citizenship, symbolized in the right to vote, and denied access to ladders of opportunity and social upward mobility. Those who have served their time in America's prisons or who plead guilty in exchange for little or no actual prison time are often condemned to eternal social damnation. They are not part of a class, but a permanent caste system of political pariahs and economic lepers, condemned in a very real sense to check a box on applications for employment and other applications reminiscent of the ancient biblical stigma, unclean. Given the sheer magnitude and broad implications of this assault on black people's humanity and their ability to sustain viable communities, one might characterize the quietude and lack of mobilization in the black churches and among black liberation theologians as something akin to what the latter labeled in an earlier era of the 20th century the de-radicalization of the black church. The truth is, black theologians have been no more responsive in the actual content of their critical reflections and work on the prison industrial complex and the mass incarceration sweeping black communities than were conservative, politically disengaged black pastors during the era of lynching and Jim Crow segregation. How does one account for the de-radicalization of black theology and the black church? Since we do not ourselves face severely repressive tactics of domination and intimidation like lynching, the question is, why have we black pastors and black theologians not said more on this issue, which represents for our generation what slavery and Jim Crow segregation and lynching represented for earlier generations? I suggest several reasons. Neither the black church nor black theology has put forth a clear, sustained public theological voice and moral witness on the subject of mass incarceration and its human rights implications in the 21st century. To be sure, scores of black churches have prison ministries, and some even have reclamation ministries for formerly incarcerated individuals. Extremely important work. But there is a vast difference between offering pastoral care and spiritual guidance and even support to the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated and challenging the public policies, laws, and policing practices that lead to the disproportionate incarceration of people of color in the first place. The relative absence of black church praxis and speech around the glaring political contradictions of mass incarceration can be attributed, one, to a sharp emphasis upon privatistic piety in black churches. Two, the social and moral stigma attached to the issues of crime, the drug trade, and those involved. And three, the divide between black theology and the black church. First, privatistic piety. The black church is, for reasons of history and theology, a church with a divided mind, shaped by the evangelical fervor of the period of the Great Awakenings and other similar revivalistic movements. Its proclamation has posited the theological sensibilities of a profoundly privatistic piety, emphasizing the freedom of the soul. On the other hand, because it was formed within the context of the American slaveocracy and born fighting for freedom, the black church has also embodied in its proclamation and demonstrated through its praxis a prominent theme of political protest aimed at the biblical view of salvation as deliverance into a good and broad land, a new heaven and a new earth. Put another way, black churches have addressed their ministries both to the slavery of sin and the sin of slavery. To be sure, in the broad sweep of black church history, both themes are present and prominent, sometimes complementing, and at other times competing with one another for dominance as the black church wrestles through the dilemmas and double consciousness of its own identity and sense of mission. Yet, because the soteriological imagination of the American churches has tended to be largely individualistic in a way that mirrors the culture itself, and because black churches have not been sufficiently self-critical and self-reflective about the theological meaning of their own distinctive history and liberationist heritage of radical protest, a privatistic piety emphasizing the salvation of individual souls while eschewing the hard political work of transforming the society tends to be the default position, even for black churches. Because it too is a largely evangelical church. It is not too difficult to see how the black church, caught up in the unexamined political presuppositions of the American evangelical ethos, can become self-alienated from its own liberationist legacy. Moreover, with the increasing middle class upward mobility of much of its membership in the decades after the Civil Rights Movement, increasing alienation from the black church's revolutionary sensibilities risks becoming wholesale abandonment of the work of freedom fighting as even relevant to its Christian identity and praxis. Amidst the serenity and safety of the sanctuaries of our churches, the focus too often is upon souls alone, because the endangered black bodies warehoused in America's prisons, unlike those oppressed during the era of Jim Crow segregation, are both out of sight and out of mind. Yet, this kind of truncated view of salvation has always been dangerous, particularly for oppressed people. Its tragic political implications can be clearly seen in a letter written by George Whitefield, a prominent preacher during the Great Awakening and a fierce advocate of saving the souls of slaves while keeping their bodies in physical bondage. Whitefield gloats in a letter to a friend that, quote, near 50 Negroes came to give me thanks for what God had done to their souls. I believe masters and mistresses will shortly see that Christianity will not make their Negroes worse slaves. To the contrary, African American Christians resisted this truncated view of salvation, embracing instead a view of divine liberation, both from the slavery of sin and the sin of slavery. Evidenced in the spirituals, the prominence and distinctive hermeneutical deployment of the Exodus motif, subversive survival ethics like putting on old massa, and other elements of the slave tradition represent an oppositional piety whose distance from that expressed by Whitefield was, in the words of Albert Rabbitoe, wide and deep, representing what Dwight Hopkins calls the co-constitution of the black self. In other words, we weren't simply converted to Christianity, we converted Christianity into a liberating faith. Howard Thurman said, by some amazing but vastly creative spirituality, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. African American slaves rightly understood that a narrow individualistic conception of Christian salvation and personal piety could never provide an effective moral response to slavery. Their descendants, indeed all freedom-loving people, should know that such a distorted piety can never adequately address itself to the systemic injustices of America's prison industrial complex, in many ways a postmodern mutation of the same white supremacist logic that gave birth to slavery and Jim Crow segregation. But if the privatistic piety of the churches presents a theological barrier, it is further complicated by the moral and social stigma attached to inmates, particularly the guilty, and the ethical dilemmas and complexities therein. Personal piety, stigma. Given the investments of corporate and political interests in the colossal public policy failure that is mass incarceration, it is clear that nothing short of a massive and sustained movement will undo it and move the nation in a different direction. But how do you build an effective social movement, particularly among church persons, when the primary subjects of its advocacy are those stigmatized by the label convicted felon? It is one thing to stand up for Rosa Parks, whom Martin Luther King Jr. called, quote, one of the most respected people in the Negro community. It is quite another to fight. I thought I was in the black church. That's all right, brother. You got a Hammond. It is quite another to fight for the basic human dignity of persons whose individual behavior may well be deplorable and who bear some culpability for their condition. Indeed, this is part of the conundrum posed by racial bias in the criminal justice system. In a world where ordinary black people must still navigate every day the racial politics of respectability, bearing the burden of being twice as good and, quote, a credit to the race. Nobody else has to be a credit to the race. Those who find themselves caught up in the criminal justice system, in the minds of many in the black community, have not kept their side of the deal. If many outside of the African American community view these young black men who track through the courtrooms of every major American city every single day with fear and contempt, many within their own families and churches harbor feelings of disappointment, anger, and ambivalence. I've had more than one defense attorney to tell me that their worst nightmare on a jury is somebody who goes to church. These young brothers and sisters are the ultimate outsiders, stigmatized as both black and criminal, two words that have long been interchangeable in the Western moral imagination. The historical interchangeability of the two is ironically and tragically embodied in the movement that Black Lives Matter represents. But it is also embodied in the fact that even upon release from prison, many of the same discriminations suffered upon black people during segregation are the lifelong lot of convicted felons, including discrimination in employment, housing, and voting. No matter how long ago the crime occurred or what heroic efforts may have been put forth to achieve personal redemption, they are reminded each time they are presented with an application for employment or other paths of inclusion in the marketplace of the black mark that hangs over their lives. This is eternal social damnation. Yet the real impact of the stigma of criminality is even more pervasive than that, as the vicious tentacles of its insinuation steal life from those who have been arrested but never convicted. Arrested, never convicted, and still serving a life sentence. Recently, Ebenezer Baptist Church led our county officials, our law enforcement community, the courts, and believe it or not, the GBI, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. We convinced all of them to come to church and work together in one room all day long for a one-day expungement seminar. Millions of American citizens who have been arrested but not convicted are stigmatized, unable to find employment or even rent an apartment. We were only the second county, as far as we know, in the nation, with Cook County being the first, to host a one-day expungement seminar. We held ours in our church. What normally takes 120 days, we did in one day. It was one of my most fulfilling days in ministry. As I looked across a sea of faces in the sanctuary, and I knew that everybody sitting in the pews that day had a record. If it was Sunday morning, because I'm a Baptist preacher, I would tell you that that's the case every Sunday. All of us. That's for next Sunday. But by the end of the day, dozens of citizens had their records expunged and their lives redeemed. It's a way of addressing the issue to which Jesus addressed most of his ministry: stigma. But no group is more stigmatized than those persons on death row. After years of steady decline and presumptive death of the death penalty by many criminologists, the death penalty reemerged as part of a conservative backlash in the years immediately following the civil rights movement. In a real sense, it is the final fail-safe of white supremacy. For the data clearly show that its use ensures that in the final analysis, the lives of white people are to be regarded as more valuable than the lives of black people. That is why the race of the victim, more than anything else, determines the likelihood that the punishment will be death by execution. And if the victim is white and the presumed perpetrator is African American, the symbolic power of condemning that cardinal trespass is every bit as important as ensuring that the actual African American who committed the offense is executed. The logic of Jim Crow in a new era. That is still true decades after the era of lynching became exceedingly clear to me a few years ago during my public advocacy for death row inmate Troy Davis. Troy Davis and I were the same age. And we grew up, we didn't know each other, but we grew up in the same city. But by the time I met Troy Davis, I was pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And as I became involved with his case, both as pastor to him and his family, and a public advocate for the sparing of his life, he had been on death row while I was in seminary. Convicted in 1991, the year I graduated from college, for the 1989 slaying of Savannah police officer Mark Allen McPhail. It was 2008, and we held the first of several rallies for him at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Davis's case had already gained national and international attention and brought together unlikely allies in the struggle to save his life. It embodied so clearly all that is wrong with America's deployment of the death penalty that even death penalty proponents like William Sessions, former head of the FBI, and Bob Barr, a conservative Georgia congressman with whom I disagree 95% of the time. 99% of the time. Stood in agreement with liberals like President Jimmy Carter and Congressman John Lewis against the execution of Troy Davis. Even the death row proponent said, "You got this one wrong. There's not enough evidence." The trial provided no physical evidence in support of Davis's conviction, no murder weapon, DNA evidence, or surveillance tapes were ever produced. And in a trial based largely on witness testimony, 7 of the 9 witnesses supporting the prosecution's case recanted or materially changed their testimony. That's why on 3 separate occasions, Davis's execution was stayed within minutes of his death. One might argue that is its own cruel and unusual punishment. Finally, I stood, I shall never forget, in a prison yard with his family and hundreds of others one fall night, September 21st, 2011, as Troy Davis was stretched out and strapped to a gurney. bearing an eerie resemblance to a crucifix, and executed in my name as a citizen of the state of Georgia by lethal injection. And in the years that I have continued to fight for Davis and others like him, and for the soul of a nation scarred by deep contradictions in the criminal justice system, and for the lives of young black men like Trayvon Martin, who was tragically endangered and murdered by the stigma of blackness as criminality, I have often reminded myself that I preach each week in memory of a death row inmate convicted on trumped-up charges at the behest of self-righteous religious authorities and executed by the state without the benefit of due process. The cross, the Roman Empire's method of execution, reserved for subversives, is an enduring symbol of stigma and shame. Yet the early followers of Jesus embraced the scandal of the cross, calling it the power of God. To tell that story is to tell the story of stigmatized human beings. To embrace the cross is to bear witness to the truth and power of God, subverting human assumptions about truth and power, pointing beyond the tragic limits of a given moment toward the promise of the resurrection. It is to see what an imprisoned exile of a persecuted community saw as he captured in Scripture the vision and hope of a new heaven and a new earth, the kingdom of God invading the kingdoms of this world. But because that hard work involves both serious critical reflection and sustained revolutionary praxis, it is a project well served by the bridging of the yawning chasm between black theology and the black church. Ironically, the explosive and unprecedented growth of America's prison industrial complex, in practice the clearest and perhaps the most consequential incarnation of racial oppression in this era, and the growing divide between black theology and the black church have occurred roughly during the same period. Holding each other in suspicion and at arm's length, over the last 30 years or so, black theology and the black church have not said enough to one another. And neither has said enough or done enough to resist what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. While acknowledging their distinctive roles, I submit that the increasing distance between the black church and black theology and the deafening silence of the black church with respect to this and other issues in the public square are not unrelated. Born fighting for freedom, the black church is the living, countervailing conscience of American Christian piety. Emerging in the wake of the civil rights movement, black theology as a movement represents the radical side of the black church. As a radical theology, it is a liberationist faith questioning itself, a principled critic of the church from within the church, asking anew in each Sitzenleben whether the church, in proclamation and praxis, is living out its liberationist vocation. The black church needs black theology, and black and womanist theologies need the black church. But with the demise of the NCBC, an organization of theologians and pastors working together, and a significant institutional site for the actual doing of black theology in its early days, Black theology has become increasingly academic in its focus, and the black church has become dangerously conservative. The former has lost its heart, the will to actually change the world, as black and womanist scholars gather at the American Academy of Religion, the Society for the Study of Black Literature, the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Thank you, Shelby, Rooks, and other regular enclaves of the Guild. But if black theology has lost its heart, the black church has lost its mind. As black pastors and their churches become theologically self-absorbed, preaching an uncritical faith of individual prosperity, which Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer would not understand, giving in to the stealthy pietistic rhetoric of conservative evangelicalism, not recognizing the critical distance between the presuppositions of the latter and their own countervailing heritage of liberation. I submit that the two need to return to their revolutionary origins. Meanwhile, the black body is once again, quite literally, trapped at the center of what Gunnar Myrdal characterized in 1944 as the American dilemma. 3/4 of a century later, the black body remains the central text in the narrative of a contradiction called America. For all who would understand who we are as Americans, the black body is required reading. Viewed essentially as a problem, formerly enslaved black bodies and lynched black bodies and segregated black bodies are now stopped black bodies, frisked black bodies, groped black bodies, searched, handcuffed black bodies, incarcerated black bodies, executed, paroled, probated, but never emancipated black bodies. And of course, all of this will likely get worse under the racist preoccupations and fascist predilections of the current administration and its Injustice Department, led by one named after his Confederate forebears, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions. This is why there's no more important test to the character of the American churches in general, and black churches and black theology in particular, given our liberationist claims, than our response to this human rights nightmare unfolding on our watch. If white theologians, pastors, and the churches they serve will not lend their voices to the struggle of dismantling the prison industrial complex, then they will have proven that they are every bit as much invested in the logic and privilege of white supremacy as their predecessors of the eras of chattel slavery and Jim Crow segregation. But if black theology and the black church will not give themselves over to this newest incarnation of the struggle to save black bodies, then they will have lost their soul and their reason for being. And if that is true, both deserve to die. That is why it is urgent that black and womanist theologians and black pastors convene a new and urgent conversation and commence a new moment of risk-taking dialogue between ivory towers and ebony trenches, so that our praxis might live, and so that a new and militant church preaching deliverance to the incarcerated might be born again. Their lives and the soul of the nation depend on it.
We have a Q&A now. Sure. Go ahead.
We want to thank Dr. Warnock for his lecture. And at this time, we're going to open up the floor for about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers with him. So if anybody has a question.
Yes, peace and blessings. My name is Salim Muhammad. And the question I want to ask you about, I was watching cable a couple of years back, and they were talking about these secret underground prisons that they have. Are you aware of those institutions, sir?
Secret?
Underground prisons, yeah.
Say more.
I'm asking you. I just saw it on cable, and they brought that subject up.
I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
I'm dealing with the ones that I can see. That's over 2 million people right there. But certainly lots of cruel and inhumane punishment happens in our prisons. People are put in solitary confinement. Children carry burdens that represent the kind of human rights contradiction that's not legal in other countries. We have a long way to go to embrace the democracy that we claim in our rhetoric and in our charter documents.
Good evening and thank you. My question is with regard to those who serve in lay leadership in the Black church. I'm with Trinity United Church of Christ. I serve with our Justice Watch team. And so I'm concerned about the work that we do with our youth. How we can empower our youth to understand the context of your argument tonight so that they can become more sensitively aware of the predicament and how they can become a voice to partner with our mass incarceration movement that we are already involved in. But it's the youth who have such great power but don't know how to use that voice all the time. And I'd like to know if you have some ideas on how we can do that.
Well, I think in a lot of ways, young people, black and white, and across racial lines, are leading the way. They are leading the way, and they're frustrated with the church. We're seeing a movement that in many ways is not connected to the church, which is why I spoke the way that I did tonight. Out of a deep sense of love. You've got to know I'm firmly situated and positioned. Obviously, I love the church. I've given my life to it. I love theology. I'm committed. I understand what black theology represents. But the youth, in many ways, are leading the way. So I think the older generation can be certainly helpful, provide wisdom and insight. But the liberation theologians talk about the hermeneutical privilege of the poor. I think that there's some young people, particularly in our inner cities, who do not enjoy a certain kind of class privilege, who have much to teach us about this moment. And part of what we have to resist, I said to my church when the Black Lives Matter movement emerged, and there were those who began to critique what was going on, and part of what we have to resist is this false memory of this perfect and pristine movement where, Dr. King and others showed up in crisp white shirts and well-tailored suits, and they just stood and began to speak like the voice of God, and everybody knew exactly what to do. And there weren't any arguments and fissures going on. But anybody who's a serious student of the movement knows that people are trying for decades to figure this thing out. Rosa Parks was far from a quiet little lady sitting down on the bus one day because she was tired. She was a subversive before that happened, and she was a subversive after it happened. And part of the way in which they depicted her was part of the brilliance of the movement. But Stokely Carmichael and Dr. King, SNCC and SCLC, there were arguments. And, while I believe in the ethic of nonviolence, we need to have a sophisticated understanding of that. Because Dr. King's movement in some ways counted on violence. I mean, you knew it was coming. And so we need to work with our young people and encourage them.
Thanks, Dr. Warnock. Wanted to get a sense in your evaluation and assessment of the divided mind of the Black church of who we really have been. As we consider the historical kind of fissures and challenges between a Cone and a Joseph Jackson, the larger bodies, this stream of conservatism that's always been in the Black church, while it seems that we desire to be, particularly in settings like this much more liberative institution and body, as you assessed in your studies both of these strands, who have we been if we consider the masses of Black people or the primary strands? Has it really been this kind of liberation strand, or has it been this more conservative strand for more of our lives, at least in this continent?
Yeah, what I try to show in my text, The Divided Mind of the Black Church, Theology, Piety, and Public Witness, New York University Press, $24.95. Amazon.com, I'm just kidding. What I try to show that Dr. Wilson, is that it's always been complicated. So part of my issue with my friend Eddie Glaude, who declared the other day, for a couple of years ago, that the Black church is dead. And Eddie Glaude and I were students together at Morehouse, and I called him out and said, I didn't know you were a mortician, but he declared that the Black church is dead. I wasn't so much mad at him for saying that because it was kind of a wake-up call. But and I said this to the students earlier today, part of the reason the church has been so important to us is this argument about what's wrong with the church today and what's wrong with the Black church. Can we shake it up and wake it up? We've been having that argument for about 2 centuries. So because it's that vital. And it's that critical. And so I'm grateful that people are concerned about it. It's always been a mixed bag. And those who are really engaged and struggle have always been a remnant. The movement, that's a remnant. And then Dr. King, and a wonderful thing about living in Atlanta is I get to talk to Andy Young and John Lewis and others all the time. And so the movement, the SCLC, that movement, they're the radical remnant. And still Dr. King went much further than the people who were around him. Toward the end of his life, Ambassador Young says that Dr. King said, what this movement really needs is for some of us to go to jail for a few years, he said, and serve some hard time. Dr. King was in a place where most of us never go, but he was deeply, deeply committed. But it's always been a mixed bag. What I want to say real quick on the youth question, what I was going to say is I'm encouraged by the young who are out in Missouri and all around the country engaging this issue. And what would be far more disturbing than any kind of hiccup, we certainly want, to encourage people to be disciplined. But what would be far more disturbing than any of these kind of little flares that the media wants to focus on is if all of the stuff that I tried to talk about tonight was going on and there was no response from the youth. Then we would really be in trouble. But the fact that they're concerned enough to be engaged, and some are engaging it, and some are even lifting it up in their music, for me, that's a sign of hope.
So my question had to do with the youth too. I mean, given that they are leading the movement in some respects, the other thing about them is that they're also the ones with the biggest targets on their backs. They're targeted and censured rapidly. And how do we give support, build an arc of safety for a churchless youth, or youth that's alienated from the church, or youth that's not buying any good news from the church?
Yeah.
How do we build some kind of arc of safety, some kind of arc of safety? Yeah.
Gather somewhere other than in church. You know, the early church, you know, they weren't. What about, you know? So we're in this moment where mainline Protestantism and, you know, churches trying to figure it out, how to get more people in our pews. Well, we're asking the wrong question. How to get more people in here? The question is, how do we get out there? And I think Starsky Wilson and others, and Tracy Blackman, my good friend, in the midst of that Ferguson moment, which was so volatile, many of them embodied that. They literally did surround the kids and supported them and protected them in a lot of ways. And but then they had to hang out there. They had to be incarnational. They had to be present because they were deeply suspicious of the church. And they had to stay there long enough to convince people, to convince them that they really were here. It's a good question. And in some ways, it's not a brand new question because, you know, Birmingham, and we think about this, sometimes we look in retrospect, it was so clear. It's not clear at all. I think about this sometimes. Dr. King, can you imagine the burden that was on him and others who were leading the movement? Because you're in Birmingham and you're trying to figure this thing out. But they didn't really get traction for a while. It took off when first high school kids and then middle school kids and then some of the babies started leaving school and they weren't safe. And the 4 little girls. So it's never been safe. And Martin King, who was 26, in some ways, the movement very often does give up its young. And that's the tragic side of this whole thing. But the young, I think people come to that point where they say, well, what do we have to lose? What do we have to lose?
Yeah, Dr. Warnock, I appreciate that comment you just made because that's the same thing that happened in South Africa, too. It was the kids
Children of Soweto
that brought about
That's
what was happening there. But you talk about the theologians in the church, and I know you've begun to talk about the youth movement out there in the church. And the question is, how does the church catch up with that? And so, and lastly, what the heck do the seminaries do?
I'm going to let that hang out there so you all, as homework.
We have 3 more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Warnock. It's a pleasure to see you again. And I noticed that you had brought up Andy Young and Representative John Lewis as being remnants of the radical movement. However, Andy Young was quoted as calling Black Lives Matter in Atlanta unlovable brats just last summer, right? And so with someone such as you, who has respect in the activist movement, as well as the older clergy and the radical remnant, like, where is this disconnect to where there aren't, these parallels seen? And how do you see that fissure being mended?
Yeah, very good question. I love and have deep respect for Ambassador Young and others who are engaged in that movement. And it's not just a movement, even afterwards, just all of the things that he has done. It's just an extraordinary life. And he's an extraordinary human being, which I've gotten to see up close. I happened to be with Ambassador Young and sleeping in the same house the week he said that. We were together at the Chautauqua Institution, and I was the chaplain for the week and was preaching. He arrived, he had just made that comment, and so we were together all week. One of the leaders from the movement, who's based in Baltimore, his name escapes me. He was supposed to speak, but he didn't make it because he got arrested. Direct. And so I was there already preaching and speaking anyway, but since DeRay wasn't able to make it, they pulled together on the program Ambassador Young, my wife who's working on a PhD in history at Columbia University, Ulay, Bill Moyers, and Andy Young. And the four of us were on the stage together debating Black Lives Matter, a conversation that we've continued since then. But it's, I mean, if you, I can't speak for Ambassador Young, but it's an interesting kind of position he's taken, and it was interesting that day as we were debating this issue. I think it's up to your generation, to figure out what are we going to do, what are you going to do. I think maybe when you've worked so hard for something for so long, and you look up and you're near the end of your life, it can, I don't know how that might wear you out. It just wears on you. Like, here I am, we're still talking about this. But yeah, we're still talking about this. And we have to keep on talking about it. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, I confronted him. Oh yeah, we gave him a fit. I mean, Andy was Andy. We were arguing back and forth, and I won't even tell you some of the stuff he said. It was worse than that. But but look, you're going to have arguments, and they had arguments then. And in some ways, Andy was playing, and this is at the risk of speaking for him, and this is sort of how he explains it. And it's true. In some ways, he was playing the role that he played all of these years. He said that Dr. King jacked him up one day and said, you about to get me killed. Because, he's got Hosea in the room and some of these other guys, and he's like, I need you're supposed to take the conservative position. And that was sort of his role. He took the conservative position, someone else would take the other position. Dr. King had this dialectical thing. Everything was Hegelian for him. And he'd come down the middle. And that's kind of the role he's played. I don't want to just focus on him. A lot of this is kind of a generational thing. And what I try to do in my position as pastor of a civil rights church is to remind the civil rights generation that that movement was not nearly as neat and buttoned up. There's never been a neat, buttoned-up movement. Like, movements are disruptive by nature. Don't kneel down during the national. Don't kneel during the national anthem. Are you kidding? Don't sit and be quiet. So movements are always messy and disruptive, and you should expect pushback, and you should expect people to be uncomfortable. because that movement was not buttoned up, and not nearly as many folk who said they were with the movement actually were. And I have fun, because I preach at Ebenezer. I say all the time that there are not enough streets in America for the black people over 55 who marched with Dr. King. Prophets are respected later. Dr. Ray.
Dr. Warnock, I have a quick question. You've spoken a lot about the black church and its responsibility. We have in our midst the next generation of theologians and scholars who are going to be writing black theology. What is the book that you want to be able to go on Amazon and find 6 years from now for $24.95? What is the book that you want to find? Because we can talk with them about and give them a charge of the work that they need to do, but I think we also need to help them conceptualize that. So tell us about the book that we should be looking for on the Amazon.
From that generation.
From this next, in fact, this row, right? This row, So I'm not just talking about, something, this row of people right here. What's the book that you want to see that they can get for $24.95, that they have to wait 2 weeks for the next shipment to come in? That's going to signal black theology is taking seriously this challenge that you've raised.
That is an excellent question, Dr. Ray. And I have a clear answer to that. And I would tell you, except that if I say it, they'll write it instead of me. I'm just... And I got a 14-month-old I got to send to college. No, I'm just kidding. No, I just think, when you have heroes and people who mentor you, and this is true not just of academics, it's true of preachers, it's true of people who want to sing and are in the music industry. When you first start writing, when you first start preaching, you are inclined to mimic somebody. And that's okay. That's not all bad. I'm not saying that, you want to have academic integrity. I don't mean really. But you sort of sound like Dr. Ray, who mentored you. And that's fine when you start out, but at some point, and this is the thing that I'm always grateful to Dr. Cone for, he always told us, find your own voice. And, I've spent all of my time trying to find my own voice. We do need people to anthologize what others have done and what others have been saying. But your moment is its own moment. You're presented with your own set of challenges. And so the question is not why didn't someone else do it? The question is, well, what are you going to do? The only reason to write theology is that everybody else who's writing it before you got it wrong. I'm saying it in an extreme. That there is some gap, that there is something yet to be said, that there's something that's missing, there's some contradiction. And many of you, I'm sure you heard it while I spoke. You said, that's all right, but good, go and work on that. And that's why you write theology, because you get up and you say there's something missing that needs, and it drives me and it wakes me up with a passion. So I can't tell them what that is. But if you dig deep enough in the text and in the text of life. If you'll baptize yourself in it, rather than sprinkle, I'm just shade to the Methodists, I'm just kidding. If you would immerse yourself in it, and you will come forth and you'll have your own voice. And we need that voice. Howard Thurman said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. Thank you and God bless you. Good night.
When the Center for the Study of Black Faith was launched, it had a tagline that said, Black faith, Black life, creativity in action. We have celebrated tonight. We have fellowship tonight. We have been moved by many different spirits tonight. And we are so grateful that we have had this night. I want to thank you for sharing this night with us. We've had trustees here at this night. If your trustees would just raise their hands. Thank you so much. We've had administration and staff here tonight. If they will raise their hand. Thank you so very much. We have faculty who is here tonight. Wave your hand. Thank you so very much. We have students here tonight. Thank you so very much for being here. And we have all these other friends, including alums who are here tonight. Thank you so very much. And all these friends who have gathered to celebrate tonight, to honor the memory and the work of the Reverend Dr. C. Shelby Rooks. I thank you for being present, and I thank you for remembering there's an envelope that you've been presented with tonight, and that you will take your time to fill in and fill out so that this thing expands, and share it with us tonight. As I've said, we are honoring the memory and the work of C. Shelby Rooks. Dr. Speller pointed out that one of the activities of Dr. Rooks was the founding of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. And there are many of us who are present this evening who are carrying on the legacy of C. Shelby Rooks through the Society for the Study of Black Religion. He served 2 terms as president of that august body. I served 1 term as president of the SSBR. We have the current president, Dr. Ray, who is here with us tonight, who is also carrying on this memory and legacy of Shelby Rooks through the SSBR. And though it wasn't stated, the Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock is a member of the SSBR, as well as many other faculty members of Chicago Theological Seminary. We are located currently in the Chicago Theological Seminary within Chicago, Illinois. We are located in the center of theological education, Chicago being what some might call a mecca of theological education. We are in the center of theological education within the incarceration capital of the world. We are gathered here as a privileged group. We are the privileged until we're pulled over for driving while black. Privileged until we draw attention to America's original sin by reverently falling down on our knees. We are privileged until we forget our place by remembering who we are. We're privileged until we all realize that none of us makes it unless all of us makes it. Let us not forget what brought us here. And as we depart from this place, let us move into a world that needs us to speak with truth and courageously carry forth the message that we are not afraid. And though they slay us, we will still love the one who has called us. Go forth, doing the work that you've been called to do by the Spirit of truth and justice. Ashe, Amen, Amen. Go in peace.